So today I wanted to talk about rather than the nature of natural kinds or parts, I wanted to focus on the activities of kind making and part making that have the results of which are putative kinds and parts. I want to look at how these concepts have been operationalized and revised in a way that shapes knowledge and in botany and in agriculture. So both empirically based investigations and analytic metaphysics provide a window through which the world becomes known. What I ask and attempt to answer is, how does what we know depend on what we think is out there in the world? My focus will be on the role conceptual commitments play in ontologizing practices. What I mean by ontologizing practices are things like partitioning and kinding activities. So within botany and in agriculture, knowledge of what something is, as well as how we should interact with it, rely on conceptual commitments. The conceptual engineering of epistemic and ethical concepts affects more than just how we categorize them. I am, of course, very interested in how they are categorized, but I also examine how some of these concepts have been engineered, re-engineered, and operationalized and revised in ways that actively shape the knowledge of botany and redesign agricultural experiments. One second, trying to advance my slides. Okay, so I'm going to start with parts, since that's the thing in the first part of the title. Parts talk is used to describe the biological structure of parts in relation to wholes. It's pretty straightforward, so you might think, what's all the fuss about? Parts may be conceived of spatially, temporally, discretely, or continuously. And the partitioning of parts relies on information from a host of sources, including anatomy, physiology, developmental biology, biochemistry, paleontology, and phylogeny, as William Wimsatt explains in this quote, that borrowing from criteria from all these different places has a tendency to make things a bit of a conceptual morass at times. I'm going to try to speak to that kind of conceptual morass today. So discussions about the nature of natural kinds, individuals, and other metaphysical categories are, of course, not new. They continue unabated while a new crop of practice-focused accounts proliferates from both within and outside of philosophy of biology. There are self-proclaimed manifestos calling for a shift in biological metaphysics from one focused on studying biological interactivity in terms of static entities to ones viewing the organic world in terms of dynamic processes. Others argue that prioritizing entities as continuance over processes is both metaphysically and epistemologically justified. Whether parthood relationships are conceived of in terms of spatially overlapping material parts, temporally ordered stages, or something else, seems to be a matter for, seems to be something that's interesting to a lot of folks, not just analytic metaphysicians. Advocates for the holobiont revolution suggest the trackability of evolutionarily significant entities rather than a single organism, but instead is a biological consortium. Well, some take this as evidence that we need to extend the notion of evolutionary synthesis. Others argue that current evolutionary biology already accommodates these multi-organism interactions with no need for any kind of radical revolution. In addition to these, many of us are turning attention to not just biological theories, but also the implicit and explicit knowledge generated from scientific practices. Even concepts like individuality, individuation, stability, and continuity that are long central to any kind of course in metaphysics are now studied in domain-specific research, where within these areas, there are collaboratives of biologists and philosophers of biology that ask not only what is the criteria for individuality, but how is individuation understood within these different fields of study. Those investigating the nature of natural kinds argue that rather than relying on the a priori explanations, often given by analytic metaphysics, we might learn more by seeking to understand natural kindhood through empirically based approaches. Some offering epistemologically justified accounts of natural kinds that are washed of what is perceived as unnecessary metaphysical commitments. Others argue, I'm one of them, that metaphysical commitments are ineliminable to any account of natural kinds. At least if what we want to do is safeguard against epistemologically justified but metaphysically nefarious accounts. In all of these discussions, there seems to be this invitation to consider how what we know depends on what we think is out there in the world, and how this informs and shapes our research endeavors. Many argue that the world, or at least our interaction with it, constrains the metaphysical categories scientists can introduce by some underlying ontology. This is often voiced in the sentiment that the world pushes back. My purpose in sketching out all these kind of contours of the debate is to provide a frame within which to consider what it means to be in a world that pushes back, but also one that we push on, and how that exchange informs our research. If what we're interested in is understanding kinds and individuals, or any other metaphysical concepts, we need to turn our attention to the activities, both mental and physical, involved in that exchange, those of discovering, of tracking, of measuring, collecting, and naming. This means attending to what scientists are doing when they're partitioning parts, individuating individuals, and kind and kinds. Understanding how the world constrains metaphysical categories that the scientist can introduce in a particular research scenario often requires that we first understand what parts ontologies are being assumed within that domain. As such, I'd claim one desideratum of any part-whole metaphysics is that it provides a way of fleshing out how the world pushing back is felt by the investigator with respect to the particular part-whole ontology they use. So I want to talk about parts, kinds, and experimental constraints. And there's 3 mini case studies I want to cover since I've got so much time. So I wanted to talk about Agnes Arbor's developmental version of Goethe's leaf root stem model. Then I'm going to talk about the different compositional pictures of Lichen part-whole relationships following Simon Schwendiner's original dual theory of Lichen. And then I want to talk about farm equipment shaped agricultural experiments based on Tuskegee Agricultural Experiment Station under the directorship of George Washington Carver. I want to start with parts, though. So usually when we say something is part of something else, reference to its parthood is thought to be metaphysically grounded. Knowing that X is a part of Y explains some relevant feature of the phenomena of which it is thought to be a part. So biologists Daniel McShay and Edward Vennett define a part as something that is both integrated internally and also isolated from its surroundings, components that may be spatially distributed, such as hormone-mediated control systems, or a local population of crickets chirping in synchrony. The concepts part and whole play important and interdependent roles in biological understanding. Within scientific investigations, these concepts furnish specific abilities of cognitive agents. For instance, the ability to identify compositional structure of a particular biological system or infer phylogenetic relationships among individuals. In this way, knowledge gained from parts talk depends on what role parts play in an explanation that refers to them. Okay, on to the leaf root stem model. So given the significant role parts and wholes play in biological explanations, we might want to investigate actually how these concepts come about, how they are revised over time, and how they guide other concept-based activities. This is the conceptual engineering part. I mean, it's all conceptual engineering, obviously, but this is going straight in for it. So I want to pursue the investigation of parts concepts in this way. In doing so, of course, I build on a long tradition of many folks who have done this. And I look to the history of science to learn how metaphysical commitments have shaped knowledge in specific biological domains. To do this, I want to focus on the origins of what's called the classical model of plant morphology. The morphology of seed plants or spermatophytes, such as fruit trees, grains, vegetables, and flowers, is understood in terms of three distinct parts: leaves, roots, and stems. But where does this partitioning come from? How was this model kind of discovered or invented? Modern plant morphology actually follows Goethe's 1790 characterization of the diversity of botanical morphology in terms of a number of ideal archetypes. Studying seeds and seedlings, Goethe initially described his metaphysical findings that everything is a leaf. He talks about this in a letter to Charlotte von Stein in 1787. So in 1790, he explained how the diversity of form in plants can be unified under a generalized model, capturing the shared morphological features of all plants: the seed leaves, foliage leaves, bracts, sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels are all, in his words, essentially the same. For Goethe, leaf was used as a concept through which plant morphology could be explained. And he writes, the process by which one and the same organ presents itself to our eyes under protean forms as a metamorphosis of plants. So greatly influenced by Goethe, British botanist Agnes Arbor in 1950 extends the classical model to a dynamic one, attending to the processes of continuous morphogenetic change over a plant's development. Rather than leaves, though, Arbor's focus is on shoots. For her, leaves are partial shoots. The leaf is a partial shoot, revealing an inherent urge towards becoming a whole shoot, but never actually attaining its goal. This is her account. Building on both Goethe and Arbor, Sattler has another version of this. So Goethe's classic leaf root stem model and Arbor's developmental extension of it continues to shape thinking within plant morphology. It's not really a static model, more of a kind of workable rule of thumb. The leaf root stem account remains, and despite evidence to the contrary, such as a whole bunch of structures that appear to be intermediate and cannot be partitioned into three exclusive organ kinds. Later accounts attempt to accommodate the possibility of intermediate structures. For instance, botanist Rolf Sattler writes that there is a continuum between the four categories: shoot, stem, leaf, and hair. The space between these four extreme concepts is filled with intermediates. Despite this, Sattler concedes this old metaphysics, arguing that even this new account is really nothing more than just a modification of or a further extension to the classical model that keeps the general tripartite structure, but removes the provision that organ structures be mutually exclusive. Although the ways in which botanists partition the plant into morphological parts might seem a bit idiosyncratic, Sattler suggests it's just not arbitrary, and in some case is actually constrained by reality. Leaf is a concept we use to identify a sort of thing, perhaps pointing to something and saying, there's a leaf as it falls from the tree. However, since stems and leaves are connected to each other in the plant, we're only really able to point out something as a leaf once we have individuated the concept of leaf from the concept of stem. Leaf is what Sattler refers to as an injunctive concept, a concept that is not and cannot be defined by means of a list of properties. Each of the four concepts, shoot, stem, leaf, and hair, functions as an injunction or a command, so that an individual structure that occupies the space between the 4 points can be a partial member of 2, 3, or 4 classes. The extreme concepts effectively map out the conceptual topology in such a way that intermediate concepts can be actually filled in. For example, structures occurring on the leaves of Begonia hispida may belong to either 100% to 0% of the leaf class, or 0 to 100% of the trichome class. So in other words, some are leaves, others are hairs, and still others are intermediate between leaves and hairs. The way a plant is partitioned into its morphological parts is constrained by reality, by virtue of the concepts that are used to carve up the conceptual space, where the entity identified as a leaf or as a stem is accurately identified is constrained by the concept of leaf or stem in use, its relationship to the object in question, and the purpose for the investigation. Okay, transitioning to lichens now. So one of the most intriguing cases where compositional metaphysics has impacted both knowledge-making and also naming practices is within research on lichens. So a little bit of background. A lichen is a symbiont. So it's made up of a system of organisms that include a fungal partner, which is called a mycobiont, and a photosynthetic partner, such as an algal or cyanobacteria partner, which is called the photobiont, as well as a community of other fungi and bacteria. The lichen structure that you see, and this is in the image called the lichen thallus, is usually when we use like a kind of folk term, we call that the lichen. But as you see in the bottom image, that the lichen is made up of different components, and the algal cells are within the fungal hyphae. So it's a very much intermeshed system. So making sense of a little bit more of this, I'm going to go into a little short history of lichenology. So studying the history of lichen research reveals that although lichens are and have been understood to be a composite system that includes a mycobiont and photobiont, the role of these parts or bionts play in lichen nomenclature has changed considerably. Although lichens were conceived of by some biologists, such as Anton de Berry, Albert Frank, Melcher Trube, and others as symbionts following Simon Schwendiner's dual theory of lichens in 1868, other prominent lichenologists, such as James Crombie and Wilhelm Nylander, resisted Schwendiner's new metaphysical characterization, as well as the role of the mycobiont in lichen naming. In the early 20th century, the use of specific names for whole lichens was actually a common practice, and one that was not losing strength, but actually gaining strength. Seeking to ensure the convention of naming whole lichens, the whole thallus, Bruce Fink, a lichenologist, went so far as to start campaigning for the lichen retaining this role in naming. So he wrote to 75 American and 75 European botanists and lichenologists, and he asked the question, should the lichen be maintained as a distinct class of plants, or should they be distributed among the fungi? So of the 115 replies he received, only about 17% favored distribution. About 12% were kind of undecided. They were like, probably it could be distributed, but actually they preferred to have it stay undistributed and being the distinct group of lichens. 83% of those who responded said that the lichen should be maintained as a distinct group. And of course, the lichenists nearly unanimously favor maintaining the group of lichens as lichens and not distributed among fungi. Fink was not alone. Others, such as Eugen Thomas in 1939, suggested that lichen symbionts be assigned to a specific nomenclature that was distinct from the nomenclature of its fungal or algal partner. Thomas's specific recommendation was to use the lichen name only as a name for the lichens. The lichen fungi are to be named by a genus of the lichen with the ending "myces," and the species name of the lichen in the genitive. Due to ambiguity, the term gonida is used to denote the lichen algae then. Alternative naming practices like Thomas's were ultimately rejected though. And the convention of naming lichens as separate from their fungal or algal partners actually halted in 1950. This is when the amendment to the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature anchored the naming of the lichen symbiont exclusively to its fungal partner. This meant that for the purposes of naming, lichens should be considered as if they were fungi. So basically the algal partner is unnamed. So a lot of different metaphysical perspectives arose as a result of this kind of naming procedure. The use of these different conceptual pictures of lichen-part-whole relationships have continued. Currently, there's probably more than 5, but I could find 5 that one might take to understanding the whole lichen and its parts. So can think about lichens as fungi, following the naming convention where fungal constructs, the lichens are fungal constructs. It's all about the fungus doing the whole job of making the lichen. And it's just a dietary strategy for fungi. It just borrows the photobiont partner, the algae, because it needs to make food. And it's like, that's convenient. I'll just have one of those. It could be that lichens are actually considered to be algal constructs. So thinking about lichenizing fungi, this actually makes sense since lichenizing fungi are actually obligate symbionts. Algal partners can exist on their own. Fungal partners cannot exist without their algal partners. Or we can think about lichens as organisms. Lichens might qualify as organisms because they are self-sufficient, self-replicating, and visible to evolution in roughly, but not exactly the same way as their fungal and algal partners. We can also think of lichens as ecosystems. So the lichen bionts interact as externally integrated networks composed of exchangeable parts. It's not surprising that the lichen was one of the first, was the first organisms described as a symbiont, and probably the most holobonty, I don't know if that's a word, the most holobonty of the kind of holobionts that there is. Lichens could be understood as evolutionary complexes. You can think about lichens as a nexus or locus of many parts that remain constant from one thallus to the next, from one generation to the next, in a degree over evolutionary time. So these compositional pictures of lichen metaphysics each furnish different abilities to the investigator holding them. So naturalist and lichenologist Trevor Goward suggests that looking at lichens as a dietary strategy for fungi means we'll view lichens as organisms that are self-sufficient and visible to evolution in roughly the same way as their fungal partner. Whereas if we consider lichens to be ecosystems, lichens are thought of as diffuse, externally integrated systems composed of exchangeable parts. But if what is of interest is lichen and not fungal evolution, then it might be best to conceive of them as evolutionary complexes. So it is above all maybe that not so much the parts, but the complex that exists in the thallus from one generation to the next. So depending on which lichen metaphysics you take on, this has actually implications for how you compare parts. Commitment to a particular compositional perspective seems to matter. Which perspective one holds impacts the decisions they make. For instance, about whether two lichens can be compared as similar or different. For instance, about whether two lichens can be compared like the ones that I'm going to talk about here. So this is because judgments of sameness and difference ultimately depend on what one understands to be the primary parts of lichen. So take, for example, panther pelt. Panther pelt is the non-scientific name, is the common name referring to this particular lichen. So panther pelt is much better known to lichenologists by the name of its fungal partner, Pelterga britannica. So what's special about P. britannica is that it contributes to two quite different lichens, and I have this in the image here with the little names. So one of these is panther pelt, where the photopartner is a Cyanobacterium nostoc. The other is deciduous pelt, in which the dominant, but it's important to say not exclusive, photopartner is an alga, which is Cocomixa. Most or all lichenologists actually refer to panther pelt and deciduous pelt as two forms of one and the same lichen. The first they refer to as the cyanomorph or cyanotype of the second, and the second as the chloromorph or the chlorotype of the first. Still, to the extent to which this assessment of equivalence is accurate, or at any rate, even just helpful, one must ultimately depend on the extent to which the lichen fungus and the lichen really are one and the same thing. The decision about identity, then, ultimately depends on what one takes one's lichen compositional metaphysics to be. Panther pelt and deciduous pelt are considered two forms of the same kind only insofar as one ascribes to the notion of lichens as a dietary strategy for fungi, where the continuity of the mycobiont and not the photobiont is considered evolutionarily and taxonomically significant. That is, if one already assumes that the parthood relationship between the fungus and the whole symbiont is what maintains the lichen over generations. But of course, one might be wrong about this. Indeed, the conditions for stability might not be based on the fungal partner. One's decision about identity, what is the same as something else, is determined by what one thinks is the correct lichen-partwhole relationship. Okay, on to agricultural kinds. Okay, so my third mini case study has to do with conceptual commitments and the categorizations that rely on them that don't just shape the kinds of knowledge of the classifications or the naming that is available, but also defined what can be inferred from experiments that rely on them. That is, the world pushing back can also be felt in terms of normative constraints and result in normative kinding practices. Categorization is part of scientific activities that shape the epistemic and normative landscape. For instance, what counts as evidence in a particular experiment is something that may only be understood as evidence when it is evaluated within the context of experiential goals and purposes that are defined by the experimenter in setting up the experimental conditions, the protocols, and setting the actual problem. Understanding the problem means knowing what sort of thing might be understood as possible evidence. Categories then provide the relationship between the results of the experiments, those things referred to as facts, and the conceptual schemes that are in use. To discuss agricultural kinds, I want to talk about the integrated history and philosophy of a specialized form of collaboratively formed knowledge and how this form of knowledge has been shaped by agricultural extension. So despite being a kind of robust area of interdisciplinary work, especially in STS and sociology and history of science, the ongoing work of folks like Paris Sandin, Rachel Ankeny, Sabina Lichenology, Helen Curry, and Paul Thompson in food and agricultural ethics and philosophy, agriculture remains kind of an area of research that's less familiar in philosophy of science, and also one that is highly location specific. For instance, although there are similarities between the US and Europe, US extension is still largely publicly funded, whereas in Europe there has been more of a move towards more private companies to be involved in extension projects. And of course, their agricultural histories are very different as well. Modern extension that began in Ireland began in 1847 with Lauren Clarendon's traveling instructors during the Great Famine. It expanded in Germany in the 1850s through the Wanderlehrer, the itinerant agricultural teachers, and then later in the US context. So agronomy and agricultural extension in the US context is what I'm going to be focusing today. So it's a very integrated history in the US. The US agronomy research was actually made a mission for public universities called land-grant universities. Michigan State University is actually one of them. They always say it's the first one, which may or may not be contentious. But land-grant universities were actually meant to provide education to farmers, but not just agricultural, but also liberal arts education. This was based on the Hatch Act of 1887, which created agricultural experimental stations, and the 1914 Smith-Lever Act associated extension work with land-grant universities in what's called the Cooperative Extension Service. What this did is it made a formal union between agronomy research, extension work, and farming. So it made that a formal union. So agricultural extension is this formalized system of communication practices that established between farmers, university researchers, regulators to exchange ideas about new agricultural research and technology and basically make it work in the field. Agricultural extension work brings together researchers and farmers, exchanging information about how to improve production, increase crop diversity, provide nutrient support for soil, manage your irrigation practices, and control pests and diseases. That is one of the reasons why it's so localized, because pests are different, the irrigation is different, the soil is different in all of these different areas. Oh, I have to say something about the trains. This is possible. I love trains, by the way. So this is possibly one of the best pictures I've ever found in an archive. So this is at Michigan State University. And they actually have this this soil testing train that was used in 1926, where the train would go along different places in Michigan, so that farmers had an ability to test their soil. And testing their soil is important because then you can know how much irrigation, how much added nutrients you needed, and what kind of crops would grow best in your soil. Because it originally was by train here. So I've largely been focusing on soil testing and soil diversity and long-term agroecological experiments. This has been a combination of archive work with MSU Extension Archives, but also with Tuskegee Institute Agricultural Experiment Station archives because they've just become publicly available. And I've also been looking at current long-term agro-system research experiments conducted at Michigan State University at their Kellogg Biological Station. So in Michigan, this focus on soil management, experimentation, and soil history has this long history. Unfortunately, they no longer have the soil testing trains. I wish they did, but they do not. But this is important to, early soil testing for farmers. Okay, so I want to talk about the Tuskegee case because it's different from Michigan State. And it also has an incredibly super famous person who was the director between 1896 and 1942, which is George Washington Carver. For those of you guys probably in the US, George Washington Carver as the person who made peanuts a thing for as a foodstuff for people. He is kind of taught in grade school as this hero of agriculture. Probably, not many people know about George Washington Carver outside of the US context. I just think that's also why in Europe you get your chocolate with hazelnuts rather than peanuts, like we do in the US. Anyway, so George Washington Carver was director, and this is also amazing stuff from the archives. He was not originally from Alabama, but he went to Tuskegee after Iowa and was just a little bit horrified by the soil. He wanted to make things better there. His extension bulletin, so that's kind of what, as a director, you write up the work that you have done the research on in the extension station and distribute it through bulletins to farmers. So on the field work on the image on the right was actually at the experimental station. So they're actually conducting research in the fields there. So Carver's extension bulletins disseminated this practical research, which was replicating the conditions faced by local Black tenant farmers with limited resources. And you wanted to provide them with accessible strategies for improving soil productivity and crop development. I want to just focus on one of these bulletins. So this 1905 bulletin, How to Build Up Worn Out Soils. Carver actually is talking about an 8-year, so a long-term experiment on soil improvement. Began in 1897 with 10 acres of extremely poor soil. Carver selected the worst soil he could find at the experimental station, where he described the soil as being too poor to produce even a small crop of cowpeas. Cowpeas will grow almost everywhere, apparently not here. So that was kind of a thing. And he described the soil as variable in character, underlain with yellow-red mottled clays, which cropped up here and there. You don't want that in your field. It's terrible. But it was a very common soil type in Alabama. it was covered with this light sandy loam that is wonderful for plaster and bricklaying, not so good for planting crops. So it also just gets washed away. So lots of problems with erosion as well. So emphasizing the need for this long-term experiment to improve the soil, Carver writes that every chemist recognizes the fact that our present methods of chemical analysis do not accurately determine the crop yielding capacity of a soil, but that such analysis should be followed up by careful conducted crop experiments. So this is his way of saying the science is wrong. The world is pushing back on us. And in order to correct this, we have to set up the conditions of the experiment differently. That's exactly what Carver did. Carver changed the setup conditions of the experiment to match the local farmers' practices in Tuskegee, where farmers were using one horse and a plow. They had fields that were very similar to the one that Carver describes, with in addition to the not great soil, which is being generous, they also had hundreds of tree stumps, which is a super common problem there. So getting rid of tree stumps is great and easy to do if you've got huge machinery. However, that's not going to help any of the people that were local there. So Carver figured out how to get rid of stumps, but did so with one horse equipment. So equipment that were accessible to the local farmers. To implement crop rotation, he eliminated the emphasis on cotton, which was this cash crop that really wasn't thriving, and also you can't eat it. And instead swapped it out for nitrogen fixing peanuts, which also improved the soil. He also relied on locally available sources for fertilizer. Of course, you're not going to spend a huge amount of money buying pre-made fertilizer if you can make your own. There were swamps there, and he found that actually using the swamp muck was a really good source of improving the soil. So the conceptualization then of Carver of what agricultural kinds were, what soil was and what soil could be, what fertilizer was and what it could be, and soil managing practices were constrained by the farmers' interactions with them. They were constrained by the weather conditions. They were constrained by the goals of sustainable crops. And of course, they were constrained by the equipment to hand. So the intention was therefore of the design of Carver's research was to ensure the replicability of the experimental station results for the tenant farmers who had access to one horse. Carver actually stated this goal as the explicit aim of all experiments at Tuskegee. He said the chief aim was to keep every operation within reach of the poorest tenant farmer occupying the poorest possible soil, worthy of consideration from an agricultural point of view, and to further illustrate the productive power of all such soils can be increased from year to year until the maximum of fertility is reached. So then conceiving of agricultural kinds in this way has normative implications. Following the harvest of the 8-year soil experiment, Carver summarizes the results of this. And this is actually this wonderful picture. This is actually Carver, and he's holding a bit of the soil, the clay, from the field, and just showing how bad it is actually, and how in need of improvement. He summarizes his results here. I just replicated this. So these are normative implications, right? These are not just statements of the result of experiments. These are actually, if you have a certain conception of an agricultural kind, these are what he considered the results of this long-term experiment to be. So it pays to make a good seed bed by preparing the soil deep and pulverizing it thoroughly. So not having these big chunks of soil. He found that swamp muck and leaf mold are valuable as fertilizer and should be used. So all this like normative terms should be used whenever they can be gotten easily. That deep plowing permits the water to go into the soil, thus reducing erosion. And that peanuts should be grown by every farmer. I love that. I love that so much. So this is one of the reasons why he's famous. So peanuts add nitrogen to the soil. Nitrogen is necessary for a lot of crops. It improves the soil, and it also is an edible crop. And the fifth implication from the research is that proper manipulation of the poorest soil may be made to produce an abundance of staple crops. So this is extremely optimistic, but also this idea of sustainability was through and through part of the aim here. So the aim of replicability of the extension-focused research for the local tenant farmer was shaped and defined by the conditions of replicability of grower practices that were set up in the agricultural experiments. So for Carver, the world pushing back meant experimental controls and standards that were set by what farm equipment the farmers had. Okay, so why should we care about conceptual commitments? I tried to show why, but let me just kind of summarize a bit. So conceptual frameworks direct how organismal systems can be partitioned and kinded. They shape the setup conditions for the experiment and replicability. And with regard to plant morphology and the constituents of things like lichen symbionts, concepts of biological parts and kinds seem to supervene on the partitioning and kinding processes that investigators use, and the compositional relationships they rely on, and also the purposes for which they are partitioning and kinding. In these three cases, the answer to the question, what is a plant part in an agricultural kind, depends on what the partitioning frames and farming practices the investigator uses in conceptualizing the part or the experimental conditions necessary for the research. These conceptual commitments about the objects of study are defined in relation to the investigator and what the investigator already understands the system being investigated to be. What I've alluded to here, but I haven't discussed in detail, is that there are normative impacts to the compositional metaphysics we adopt. Within a particular investigative scenario, the investigator directs their attention to plant parts or agricultural kinds as they conceive them to be, qua plant parts and agricultural kinds. So you might be wondering, what job does the sentiment of the world pushing back really do? My aim has been to evaluate one aspect of this by attending to how the world pushes back is felt by the investigator with respect to the particular part and kind metaphysics they use. This kind of perspectival approach is one that's intended to complement the shift in the philosophical inquiry of parts and kinds from mind-independent objective contents to the world to operationalized ontologies arising through subjective partitioning, kinding, and classifying activities open to both empirical, disciplinary, and normative constraints. And that's it for me. Thank you so much. Oh, I forgot one thing. Yes, thank you very much. I also should thank my funding from the USDA on this project, Emergent Technology in Agriculture.